I grew up in a suburb of Paris, in a family with 3 children. My father is a mathematician and my mother is a pediatrician. Nothing really remarkable about my childhood except for the fact that my mother was involved in a small NGO of doctors who were helping children victims of war. So she used to have her regular work in Paris, but then from time to time she would spend a few weeks away to do this work, to help the children of the world. So I think very early on we got from that a sense that there were some children who had very, very different experiences growing up, and that gave us children a sense of how fortunate we were, and maybe how responsible we were for doing something with this good fortune. So from this experience, I've always hoped that some part of my life would be devoted to fighting poverty, but I didn't really know which part. So growing up, I thought I would have some career, and then on the side, I would work in an NGO, very much like my mom. But after some point in the middle of college, I thought maybe this is not entirely satisfactory, that my entire life should be devoted to this and not just something I would do on the side. So I thought maybe I would do into politics, or I wasn't quite sure. And I decided to spend a year to think about it. I went to Russia for 1 year. And there I was doing various things. But one of the things I was doing is to be an assistant for economists who were helping with the transition in Russia at the time, from communism to capitalism. And in this context, I realized how influential economists could be. And I thought this is actually perfect, because I had always envisioned myself as an academic, because I'm more like the sort of quiet, reflective type, and I wanted to do science. And I thought, okay, with this job, I can do my science. And at the same time, when I have something to say, I can really have a role in policy. So that's when I really decided to go into economics. Well, India is the place where I first went as a graduate student to start doing field work. And I kind of landed in Calcutta as a graduate student in my early 20s with no understanding of anything really. And it's with a lot of misconception about what it was to be poor, and in particular centered around Calcutta. Because somehow I was kind of a bit obsessed about poverty in Calcutta as a child, having grown with Mother Teresa and the like. And I arrived in Calcutta, and I was kind of shown how different the life of the poor really is, and how they were kind of going about their business and being enterprising and having issues, but not being like the helpless people that I kind of had in the corner of my mind. So from then on, it was kind of a lot of my education as a development economist and as a human being was through the work that I did in India. And then, of course, now my husband is Indian, my in-laws in India, most of my work is in India. So that's kind of a second home for me. I think you learn that people are not so different. Maybe it's one of the biggest thing that I've learned, that people live in very different circumstances. And that, of course, has implication on what they can achieve and what they can do with their lives. But at heart, we have the same type of strength as human beings and of weaknesses. And they just happen to be dipped into different contexts. I think the biggest misconception that people who are against migration have are two. One is that everybody wants to move from poor country to rich countries. And if only there was no restriction, this is the first thing that would happen. And the second is that should they come, this would have a large impact on the wages of people here, in particular low-skilled people here. And it turns out both things are just factually incorrect. So in practice, a lot of people who have the opportunity to move don't. So even within country, migration from one place to another is very low. So people don't move from the rural area of India to the urban area of India. so they're not going to move to Sweden. People don't move from the places that get hit by economic shocks in the US to other places that don't get hit by the same shocks. So fundamentally, people prefer to stay home. If you were to remove all the migration barrier, the flows would not be that big. That's the first thing. The second thing is that even when there are big migration flows, which usually comes because of a crisis, for example, the Syrian crisis did push a lot of people out. It's not that they wanted to go out, it's that they had no choice. But even when that happens, all of the history suggests that when there were such episodes, there weren't big impact on the wages of the natives. If anything, in some cases, you can see that it leads to a small increase in native wages and employment, not decrease. So that's the second misconception. So once you remove these two misconceptions, there is really no reason to be that scared of migration one way or the other. I do think that women tend to have different interests than men. I don't think it is coming from biology, but it's probably coming from early education of girls versus boys. I certainly see in the field of economics, development economics, the study of poor countries, is the only field that is really more or less equally men and women working in this field. So a lot of women come to economics because they want to study questions that have direct implication on the lives of others and can have direct impact on how to do better policy, development economics, public economics, health economics, education. So I do think that being a woman has influence probably is one reason why I'm interested in development economics. Apart from, so that's of course the most important, I think. Apart from that, I don't think there are necessarily vast difference in the way that being a woman specifically has influenced my work. Of course, I have a very specific way of working, but it's hard for me to say where it's coming from. But certainly, I think one reason why there are few Nobel Prize winners in economics is that there are few women in economics, very few. And I think one of the reasons is that many young women don't think to even go into the field because they do not realize that those topics are also part of economics. And I do hope that giving the prize to development, not only to a woman among the laureate, but just even the topic, is going to make them aware that that's a possibility, that those are part of the topics that economists study and therefore are going to serve as kind of a role model for more women to come into the field. I think there are really two ways to increase the fraction of women in economics. The first one is making people aware that economics also addresses those issues, social issues, climate, poverty. That's all part of economics. And that's not just, interest rate and making banks bigger. The second thing is the culture itself in economics is not very friendly. It's a very aggressive culture, very in-your-face culture, which many women do not particularly like. And there I think the profession can improve by being mindful of having a somewhat more civil way of engaging with each other. And I do think that actually this is already changing, that in the last few years, there have been a realization that it's not okay to be aggressive and rude, etc. And the whole field has to become more gentle. So the work on poverty is intimately connected to any work on climate change for two reasons. The first one is that climate change is already affecting the poor countries more than anywhere else. First of all, because the poor countries are in the south where it's already hot. And second of all, because there are fewer ways to adapt. So for example, it is in Bangladesh that, places are literally going to go underwater. It is in India where some parts of India are going to become inhabitable because it is too hot, and so on and so forth. And so that's the fact that it's in the south. And the fact that there are less ways to adapt is, for example, when there is a heat wave in France, it at the moment, last year there was one last summer, it doesn't kill anybody because we know what to do. And we also have the means to adjust to it so we can make sure everybody is in a cool place. And there are enough places with air conditioning that, the old people, the fragile people can be protected. And it's a matter of organization. So the first heat wave killed many people and the second heat wave didn't. In India, they just are fewer air conditioning for people living in rural area. Where are they to go? They have to continue living. And the agriculture is also not resilient to the heat and so on and so forth. So they have less ability to adapt, and therefore it's much, much more costly. And the same number of hot days in India kills more people than it does in America or in Sweden if you have hot days sometimes. So that's one reason why I think the change in the planet's climate could easily undo all of the progress, or most of the progress that have been made in fighting poverty in the last few years. The second reason is that although most of the responsibility for climate change lies with the rich country, there might be some opportunity in poor countries to do things that are going to preserve the environment. For example, the forest is not depleted yet in some places, so you could try and keep it. And there could be ways to, compensate people to keep it, etc. So there are still errors that have not been made yet in the poor countries in the way that they are going that could have an influence on climate change in the future. So that's why I think for these two reasons, you can't really be a development economist and not be worried about climate, and vice versa. You can't be concerned about sustainability and not think about the South. Let me just add that said, I think that the effort and really the bulk of the action in terms of sustainable world will have to be a reduction in consumption in the rich countries, because this is really where we are just consuming too much, period. I have one hope, which is that people's sometimes economists tend to think that people really always, all that people want is to consume more and have bigger cars and more air conditioning in the summer and more heat in the winter. But actually, I think that people's likes and preferences and needs are much more influenceable than that. So when you see a movement like the youth movement, for example, Greta's work here, it could be enough to create enough of awareness of the issue that people become aware that it is not okay to let the planet warm, and it's not just about polar bear. If you don't care about polar bear, it's also about people. And I don't think most economists tend to be a bit distrustful of the ability of individuals to care about other individuals, particularly people who are far away. But I actually don't think that is true. I think people can easily be taught to care. And once they're taught to care, I think they can also relatively easily adjust to a change in their own consumption, because we are creatures of habits. And I think if we change a little bit the way we behave, then we can get used to that so that it doesn't become that difficult. The consumption per capita of someone in Sweden is much lower than someone in America. And I don't think the Swedes are unhappier. It's just that they got used to, take the tramway to work. So I think we can get there in the sense that I think it will require changes in the way we behave here, but I don't think these changes are necessarily sacrifices. I think it's very important to ask questions that can be answered, and that can be answered in as rigorous and scientific a way as possible. So the question can be broad or it can be narrow, but it should be specific. So for example, there are questions you can ask through experiments that have vast implications. For example, is private school better than public school? That doesn't seem to be a narrow question, but it's a pretty well-defined question. And you can set up an experiment that compares the experience of children in a system that's mostly private school and in a system that's mostly public school by creating an experiment where some villages have a private school voucher offering and some villages don't. So that's not a narrow question, that's a broad question, but that's one that you can set up an experiment for. So I think to me it's very essential to try to ask these questions that are very well defined and on which you can train your kind of gaze as a scientist to answer them rigorously. And that involves usually not answering the whole problem you would like to answer at once. So I don't have any answer on whether aid work. I don't have any answer on whether, all countries should be like China. Because to me, the questions are not even very well defined. But I can answer a question on, would kids do better in a system where they had free access to private school? Or would kids do better in a system where school is provided by the government? So that's kind of how I see the difference. And then once you have your very well-defined questions, you can set up an experiment, very much like you test the effectiveness of a drug in medicine. You can look at the effect of the program, or the effect of the intervention, or the effect of structuring your school system, for example. I would say I'm an ex-climber. I used to climb a lot before having children, but now I think, first of all, I have less time, and second of all, my husband thinks that I should be sure to be alive for my children, so I should not take some unnecessary risk. So now I do all sorts of, I still climb, but indoors, and I do all sorts of other activity, like running and playing tennis and hiking. And so Michael was a young assistant professor at MIT when I came as a graduate student, and was really a kind of a visionary in seeing how you could start using experiment in the field. They existed as a technique, but almost nobody has used them. And Michael and Abhijit together started doing this work. First of all, really feeling their way around. And as a student, I was watching this happening, and this was really incredibly exciting to know that that was like a tool that could be exploited. So as soon as I basically got my PhD, I got involved in this work as well. And since then, of course, we've been working. Michael was one of the first few affiliates of our network, JPAL. We were 8 researchers at the beginning when we created the network, and he was one of them. Of course, Michael's wife, Rachel Glenister, who is now the chief economist at DFID, was for 15 years the executive director of JPAL and grew it from these 8 people to 200 affiliates and 200 fellow travelers. So I have a lot of work with Michael. I worked with him in Kenya on several projects, and we are still involved in a big project in Ghana together. And it's a kind of, I think we are very different, the three of us, in what we bring to the table. So it's always a huge pleasure to work with them. So I think what the Nobel Prize gives us is a chance for leveraging the work we have done so far and give it even more presence. So really the way you achieve any success in the fight against poverty is by working with developing country governments. It's not really NGOs or foreign aid or one of us who can make a difference. Everything happens in the developing country government themselves when they, if their policy work better and they are able to design better policy to achieve the problem that they think are important. And we've already started on this journey where we really work more and more with governments, not just to give them suggestions, but to kind of learn together. And I think this will help even more in terms of opening doors and reassuring various governments with whom we are not yet working that this is legitimate and not a strange undertaking by some crazy people. So I think that will help a lot. And I also hope that it's going to contribute to bring many more people to the field, researchers, and also to bring money to do all this work. So the whole thing should kind of move on to one more level of intensity. I am very much hoping. And then the second thing is related to this climate discussions we're having a little bit earlier, that I would hope that a lot of work also gets focused on these issues, both in rich countries and in poor countries.